The warm sun slowly dipped behind the small hills surrounding Oak Ridge, a quiet southern town where life moved at its own slow rhythm. The streets were lined with old brick houses, faded signboards, and dusty sidewalks where children played barefoot until the evening lights came on. It was the kind of place where everyone knew everyone and where secrets were rarely spoken but always felt. In one of those small houses at the edge of town lived Angela Carter, a 34-year-old single mother whose strength was admired by anyone who truly knew her story. Angela wasn't born into comfort or wealth. Life had been difficult from the very start, and she had learned early that nothing would ever be handed to her. But despite her struggles, she carried herself with quiet dignity, walking through life with her head held high. Angela worked tirelessly to provide for her only child, Marcus, a bright-eyed boy who had just turned 10. For Angela, Marcus wasn't just her son, he was her reason to keep going. Every decision she made, every sleepless night, and every ounce of energy she spent was for him. She wanted him to have the kind of life she never had, a life free from fear, from hardship, from the invisible walls that often surrounded people like her. Her days were long and exhausting. At sunrise, she worked as a cleaner at Jefferson's hardware store, scrubbing floors and wiping windows until her hands ached. In the afternoons, she shifted to a small local diner, where the sound of clinking plates and chattering customers filled the air until late evening. Even after such long hours, she would return home, prepare dinner for Marcus, help him with his homework, and finally collapse into bed only to wake up and do it all again. Yet, despite her struggles, Angela found moments of joy in the smallest things: the way Marcus's laughter filled their tiny home, the simple smell of fresh cornbread in the oven, or the quiet evenings when the two of them would sit on the porch and watch the stars come out, dreaming of better days. But life in Oak Ridge wasn't always fair. The town had a long history, one deeply rooted in unspoken divisions and quiet tensions. Some streets seemed untouched by time: same faces, same families, same opportunities passed down for generations. But for others, especially those who say the night air was warm and heavy as Angela Carter walked home from the diner, her small bag of groceries swinging gently at her side. The streets of Oak Ridge were quiet, with only the faint sound of crickets filling the silence. Street lights flickered softly, casting long shadows along the cracked sidewalks. Years passed quietly in the small southern town of Oak Ridge, but inside the modest little house on Maple Street, life was far from easy. Marcus Carter, the bright-eyed boy who once sat by the window dreaming of bigger worlds, was growing up fast. Now 17, he carried himself with a sense of the quiet streets of Oak Ridge seemed different that afternoon. A soft breeze carried through the town, rustling the old trees that lined the sidewalks. But inside the Oak Ridge Police Department, the air was thick with tension. Federal agents moved calmly but firmly, collecting documents, securing evidence, and escorting key officers into separate rooms for questioning. Marcus Carter stood in the center of it all, his expression steady, his voice calm as he issued instructions to his team. Every movement, every word, every decision carried the weight of his position as the director of the FBI, but beneath that professional composure, his heart carried something much deeper: years of memories, years of questions, and the quiet strength of his mother's sacrifices. Across the room, Chief Richard Kane sat at his desk, hands folded, silent. The once powerful figure, whose authority had shaped Oak Ridge for decades, now looked smaller somehow. His face carried no anger, only the stillness of someone realizing that the past had finally caught up. Marcus stepped forward, placing the federal documents on the desk. His voice was respectful but firm. "Chief Kane," he said evenly, "you have the right to legal representation. From this point forward, everything will be handled according to federal procedures." Kane lifted his gaze, studying Marcus for a moment before finally speaking, his voice low but steady. "You've come a long way, Marcus Carter." For a brief second, their eyes met, and Marcus saw something unexpected: not defiance, but understanding. The silence between them held years of unspoken history, but Marcus didn't dwell on it. This wasn't about settling old scores, it was about doing what was right. By evening, the operation concluded smoothly. Kane and several senior officers were escorted for questioning, while the department itself remained under federal review. Marcus stepped outside into the warm Oak Ridge air, taking a deep breath as the setting sun bathed the streets in shades of gold and amber. The same streets he once walked as a boy now felt different, lighter somehow, as if the town itself had taken its first step toward change. Later that night, Marcus drove to the small house on Maple Street. The porch light glowed softly, just as it always had, and sitting on the wooden steps was Angela Carter, waiting like she used to when Marcus came home late from school. She had been watching the news all day, her heart restless, her mind carrying memories she'd tried to forget for years. When Marcus stepped out of the car, Angela rose slowly, her hands trembling slightly as she walked toward him. Neither spoke at first. Instead, Angela simply reached out and cupped her son's face in her hands, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. "You did it," she whispered finally, her voice breaking. Marcus shook his head softly, taking her hands into his. "No, Mom," he said gently. "We did it. Everything I am, everything I've achieved, it's because of you." For a moment, they stood there in silence, mother and son, as the weight of years slowly lifted. It wasn't about revenge. It wasn't about anger. It was about healing for Angela, for Marcus, and for everyone in Oak Ridge who had quietly carried stories they were too afraid to tell. The following weeks brought change. The FBI investigation into the Oak Ridge Police Department revealed decades of improper practices, quiet dismissals of complaints, and unaddressed concerns from the community. Federal oversight was introduced, ensuring every report, every action, and every decision would now be carefully reviewed. It wasn't an easy process. Change never is. There were town meetings, heated discussions, and moments of resistance from those who struggled to accept a new system of accountability. But slowly, the atmosphere began to shift. People who once stayed silent began speaking up. Residents who had once avoided reporting problems now felt safe to do so. And within the department, younger officers stepped forward, determined to rebuild trust and serve with fairness. Marcus didn't involve himself directly in the day-to-day restructuring. His role as director required distance, but he quietly ensured the town received the resources and support it needed. His personal connection to Oak Ridge only strengthened his resolve to see the investigation through properly, with transparency and dignity. One afternoon, Angela visited the old park where she used to take Marcus as a child. She sat on the same bench where she had once watched him play, her hands folded gently in her lap. The soft laughter of children filled the air, and she smiled faintly, realizing how different the town felt now. Her thoughts drifted back to her younger self, the nights she worried about their safety, the times she had kept her fears hidden so Marcus could grow up without carrying her burdens. She thought of all the quiet strength it had taken to endure, and for the first time in years, she allowed herself to feel at peace. Marcus found her there, sitting under the shade of the old oak tree, and joined her on the bench. For a while, they sat together in silence, watching the children play. "Things are changing," Angela said softly, her voice warm with hope. Marcus nodded, a small smile touching his lips. "And it's just the beginning." Months later, the investigation concluded, and its findings became public. Richard Kane officially stepped down as police chief. Though he faced legal proceedings for administrative misconduct, Marcus ensured the process remained fair and respectful, just as he had promised his mother. Kane chose not to contest the charges, and in his quiet exit, he left behind a department determined to start fresh. For many in Oak Ridge, this marked the start of a new chapter. It wasn't about erasing the past but learning from it, acknowledging mistakes, and building something better for future generations. Marcus's work at the FBI continued, and his success drew national attention. He became known not just for his leadership but for his unwavering belief in justice, fairness, and compassion. People admired how he balanced authority with empathy, how he used his position not for power but for positive change. In interviews, when asked about his inspiration, Marcus always gave the same answer: my mother. Everything I am, I owe to her strength. Angela, ever humble, would shake her head whenever she heard him say that. To her, Marcus's achievements belonged to him alone. But deep down, she knew her sacrifices had shaped him, and that gave her quiet pride. One evening, months after the investigation had closed, Marcus and Angela stood together on their porch, watching the sun set over Oak Ridge. The air was calm, filled with the scent of blooming magnolias, and the town felt different now, lighter, safer, more hopeful. Angela leaned against the railing, her gaze thoughtful. You know, she said softly, I used to pray every night that you'd have a better life than I did. I never imagined you'd come this far. Marcus smiled, placing an arm gently around her shoulders. You prayed, he said, and you worked harder than anyone I've ever known. That's why we're here. Angela turned to him, her eyes shining. I'm proud of you, baby. Marcus held her hand, his voice steady and full of gratitude. I'm proud of us, Mom. And as the last rays of sunlight bathed the quiet little town, it felt as though a circle had finally closed. The past, once heavy with silence, had been faced with courage and truth. The present stood stronger, and the future for Marcus, for Angela, and for Oak Ridge felt brighter than ever. For the first time in years, Angela Carter slept that night without unease. And for Marcus, the journey was far from over, but his heart was lighter knowing that he had kept the promise he'd made to himself as a boy, to stand for justice. To protect those who couldn't protect themselves. And to make sure his mother would never carry her fears alone again. Purpose beyond the soft hum of the air conditioner filled the quiet office as Marcus Carter, now the director of the FBI, sat behind his large wooden desk in Washington, D.C. The stack of case files in front of him was thick, but one folder lay open, pulling his full attention. It was the federal investigation into police misconduct across several southern states, a project Marcus himself had pushed forward after years of hearing countless stories from people who had no one to fight for them. But what began as a mission for justice had suddenly become deeply personal. Because there, printed in bold letters across one page, was a name he would never forget: Richard Kane. For several long minutes, Marcus didn't move. His hands rested on the edge of the file, his gaze fixed on the words in front of him, but his mind was somewhere else, back in Oak Ridge, on that warm summer night decades ago. He remembered the way his mother, Angela, had walked through the front door with a bag of groceries, her voice steady but her hands trembling slightly. She'd told him everything was fine, but even at 10 years old, Marcus had sensed something wasn't right. And now, here it was. The same man, Richard Kane, no longer just an officer in Oak Ridge. The file revealed that he was now the police chief, holding one of the highest positions of authority in the entire county. Marcus leaned back in his chair and exhaled slowly, trying to steady his thoughts. His role demanded objectivity, but this wasn't just another name on a list. This was his mother's past, a shadow he thought he had left behind. He picked up the phone and called his senior investigative team. Start pulling everything we have on Police Chief Richard Kane, he said firmly. Every report, every complaint, every case he's been connected to. I want it all. Within hours, his team brought in thick stacks of documents and digital files. Marcus spent the evening poring over every page, every detail, until late into the night. Patterns began to emerge. Years of complaints had been quietly filed against Kane and his department, reports from residents who felt mistreated, allegations of unfair arrests, and accusations of using authority to intimidate rather than protect. Yet, strangely, none of these cases had ever gone anywhere. Internal reviews were always marked inconclusive, and the reports ended in silence. Marcus tapped his pen against the desk, his jaw tightening with each new detail. He wasn't just looking at a file, he was uncovering a system that had protected Kane for decades. The next morning, Marcus called his mother. Angela's voice was warm but slightly surprised to hear from him in the middle of the week. "Marcus, is everything all right?" He hesitated for a moment, carefully choosing his words. "Mom, do you remember Officer Kane?" There was silence on the other end of the line. A silence heavy enough that Marcus immediately regretted asking so directly. After a few seconds, Angela spoke softly, her tone cautious. "Yes. I remember him." Marcus's voice lowered. "Mom, did something happen back then? Something you never told me." Angela paused again, and he could almost hear her deep breath through the phone. "Baby," she said gently, "there are things from the past I tried to forget. Not because I don't trust you, but because I didn't want you to grow up carrying my fears." Marcus closed his eyes, his grip tightening around the phone. "You don't have to tell me everything right now," he said softly. "But Mom, I need you to know something. Kane isn't just a name from the past anymore. He's part of an ongoing investigation." Angela's voice trembled as she whispered, "Be careful, Marcus." "I will," he promised. "But this time, Mom, we're going to do this the right way." Over the next few weeks, Marcus led the investigation quietly but thoroughly. He and his team reviewed decades of records, interviewed retired officers, and collected statements from community members who had lived in Oak Ridge under Kane's leadership. Many were hesitant to speak at first, fearing consequences even after all these years. But when they learned who Marcus was and why he was involved, doors slowly began to open. People who had remained silent for decades finally began to share their stories. One elderly resident, Mrs. Evelyn Turner, described how she once filed a complaint about Kane years ago after a misunderstanding outside her grocery store. Her voice shook as she recalled how quickly the complaint was dismissed and how she'd been warned to drop the matter. A former officer from Kane's department, speaking on condition of anonymity, revealed patterns of unfair practices, residents singled out without reason, minor situations escalating unnecessarily, and entire neighborhoods living under a quiet sense of fear. As the testimonies piled up, Marcus built a timeline, carefully connecting each event, each document, and each witness statement. The more he uncovered, the clearer the picture became. This wasn't an isolated issue. It was a long-standing abuse of authority, carefully hidden beneath layers of official paperwork and silence. The evidence was strong enough for Marcus to assemble a federal task force. He briefed the Attorney General personally, outlining every detail of Kane's leadership and the troubling findings from Oak Ridge. The decision was made: the FBI would launch a formal operation to hold Kane and others accountable. Yet, despite the professional resolve in the room, Marcus couldn't ignore the personal weight pressing on his shoulders. Every late night spent reviewing files brought back images of his mother, the quiet strength in her eyes, the way she had carried pain she never voiced, and the resilience that allowed her to move forward without complaint. This wasn't just about law enforcement. This was about justice, not only for his mother but for every person in Oak Ridge who had felt powerless for so long. The operation was carefully planned over several weeks. Marcus insisted on leading it himself, despite his senior position. His team questioned the decision at first, concerned about his personal connection, but he reassured them calmly. "This isn't about me," he said firmly. "This is about doing what's right." On the morning of the operation, Marcus stood in the FBI command room, reviewing final briefings with his agents. Maps of Oak Ridge were spread across the table, showing the layout of the police department, key entry points, and deployment strategies. By noon, the task force was ready. Dozens of federal agents, dressed in plain clothes to avoid alarming the community, positioned themselves strategically around the Oak Ridge Police Department. Marcus arrived quietly, stepping out of an unmarked vehicle as he adjusted his suit jacket. He looked around the familiar streets, the same sidewalks he'd walked as a child, The same street signs he once memorized on bike rides, the same small town air heavy with memories. But this time, he wasn't here as Angela's little boy. He was here as the director of the FBI. Inside the Oak Ridge Police Department, Chief Richard Kane sat in his office, unaware of what was about to unfold. Papers were stacked neatly on his desk, and the hum of activity in the building was routine, ordinary until the glass doors opened and federal agents walked in. Marcus entered last, his presence commanding the room. Agents moved with precision, presenting legal documents and quietly instructing staff members to step aside. Within moments, the entire building fell silent, all eyes turning toward Marcus. Kane emerged from his office, confusion flashing across his face as he recognized him. For a brief moment, their eyes locked, the past colliding with the present. Marcus approached slowly, his expression calm but resolute. His voice was steady as he spoke, carrying the weight of years behind it. "Chief Kane," Marcus said, holding up the federal warrant, "you are under investigation for serious misconduct and violation of federal laws." The room went silent. Kane's face shifted from confusion to disbelief, and then to something unspoken, perhaps recognition, perhaps memory. Marcus didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. His authority was clear, his purpose undeniable. In that quiet moment, standing face to face with the man who once cast a shadow over his mother's life, Marcus felt a shift inside himself. This wasn't about revenge. It was about closure. It was about standing where his mother once stood and proving that, this time, justice would not be silent. His years. His childhood had been shaped by two powerful forces, his mother's sacrifices and the quiet shadows of the past. He remembered those long nights when Angela Carter, his mother, would return home late from work, exhausted but still smiling, holding small surprises for him: a slice of peach cobbler, a used book she'd found, or simply her warm hug that made everything feel safe. But Marcus also remembered something else: the way she tensed whenever a police car passed, the unease in her voice whenever Officer Richard Kane's name was mentioned. He never forgot the evening Kane stopped her on the street when Marcus was 10, or the quiet way she avoided talking about it afterward. Angela thought she'd hidden her fears well, but Marcus saw more than she realized. That memory became one of the silent drivers of his life. It fueled his desire to create change, not just for himself but for his mother and for people like her, who worked endlessly yet carried burdens they shouldn't have to bear. Marcus was a top student at Oak Ridge High School, known for his sharp mind, calm nature, and relentless determination. While others spent weekends hanging out at the old diner or the town's small movie theater, Marcus spent his time buried in books at the public library, often staying until the lights flickered off and the librarian gently reminded him it was closing time. He had discovered a passion for law and justice early on, inspired by stories of great leaders and landmark cases he found in dusty old encyclopedias. He devoured every book he could find about civil rights, the Constitution, and the workings of government. The more he learned, the clearer his vision became. He wanted to protect people, especially those who didn't always have a voice. Angela noticed his growing interest and encouraged it. Though money was always tight, she saved little by little to buy Marcus second-hand books and even a used laptop from a pawn shop. "You've got a gift, baby," she would tell him, stroking his hair after long study sessions. "Use it. Go as far as you can. Don't let this town hold you back." Those words stayed with Marcus. They became his compass whenever life tested him. But the road ahead wasn't easy. Oak Ridge had always been a small town with limited opportunities. Many kids from Marcus's neighborhood dropped out of school, working part-time jobs to help their families or simply giving up on dreams they thought were too big. Even teachers sometimes gently suggested more practical paths instead of college for students like Marcus. But he refused to let anyone lower his expectations. With his mother's unwavering support, Marcus applied for scholarships and worked part-time at the diner alongside her. Every late night spent wiping tables or refilling coffee cups reminded him why he was pushing so hard, because Angela had carried enough weight for both of them, and it was time he learned to carry some of it too. By the time he graduated high school, Marcus was the valedictorian of his class. On graduation day, he stood on the stage in his neatly pressed gown, delivering a speech that made the entire auditorium fall silent. "I grew up in a small town," he said, his voice steady and clear, "where people like my mother taught me what strength really looks like. She taught me that no matter where you come from, you have the power to rise above your circumstances, not just for yourself, but for others, too." Angela sat in the front row, tears streaming down her cheeks as she clapped harder than anyone else. Marcus earned a full scholarship to one of the top universities in the country, majoring in political science with a focus on criminal justice. Leaving Oak Ridge was bittersweet. It was the only home he'd ever known, yet it also carried memories and limitations he was eager to outgrow. College life opened Marcus's world. He found himself surrounded by brilliant professors and ambitious students from across the country. For the first time, he was in an environment where ideas were debated openly, where change felt possible, and where he didn't have to explain his dreams, people simply understood them. But Marcus didn't forget where he came from. While other students spent holidays traveling, Marcus always returned to Oak Ridge to visit his mother. He'd sit with her on the porch, sharing stories about his classes and professors, watching the stars above the same quiet streets he once played on as a boy. During his junior year of college, Marcus earned an internship with the Federal Bureau of Investigation. At first, it felt impossible. Thousands applied, but only a few were selected. When he received the acceptance letter, Angela cried as though she'd been the one chosen. At the FBI, Marcus thrived. His sharp analytical mind, calm demeanor, and passion for justice quickly caught the attention of senior agents. He worked tirelessly, often staying late to study case files and understand the complexities of federal investigations. He wasn't just learning how the system worked, he was learning how to change it. After graduating with honors, Marcus joined the FBI full-time. His rise through the ranks was remarkable. Colleagues admired his dedication and leadership skills, and within just a few years, he became one of the youngest special agents in the Bureau. Yet, through all his success, Marcus never forgot his mother's struggles or the small-town injustices he'd witnessed growing up. He remembered the quiet unease in Oak Ridge, the whispered stories people were too afraid to share, and the moments when fairness seemed out of reach for those without power. He made a promise to himself: he would fight for people like Angela. He would stand for those who couldn't stand for themselves. Years later, that promise led him to an extraordinary milestone. At just 38 years old, Marcus Carter was appointed as the director of the FBI, making history as one of the youngest to ever hold the position. The day of his swearing-in ceremony was surreal. Angela stood in the front row, clutching her purse tightly, her heart swelling with pride. She thought about all the nights she'd cried quietly while Marcus slept, wondering if she was doing enough. And now, here he was, standing at the highest level of federal law enforcement. Marcus shook hands with senior officials, cameras flashing around him, but in his heart, he only had one thought: this is for you, Mom. That evening, after the ceremony, Marcus returned to their small home in Oak Ridge, the same place where his journey had begun. Sitting at the same kitchen table where they once shared modest meals, Angela reached across and held his hand. "You did it," she whispered, her voice trembling with pride. "No, Mom," Marcus replied softly, squeezing her hand. "We did it." But destiny wasn't done with Marcus yet. Not long after he took office, a case landed on his desk: a federal investigation into patterns of misconduct within local police departments across several southern states. The reports detailed years of complaints, quiet cover ups, and abuses of power that had gone unchecked for far too long. Marcus flipped through the pages, his brows furrowing as he absorbed each detail. And then, suddenly, he froze. The name Richard Kane appeared on the report. Marcus leaned back in his chair, memories flooding his mind. The late summer night when Kane stopped his mother, the way her voice tightened whenever Kane's name came up, the unease that never truly left her. Now, decades later, fate had brought Kane's name back into Marcus's life, only this time, Marcus wasn't a frightened 10-year-old boy watching from a distance. He was the director of the FBI, holding the power to demand answers. He stared at the report for a long time, silent but resolute. The past he had once left behind had returned, and this time, Marcus was ready. Angela's body ached from a long day, but her heart carried a small spark of joy. Inside her grocery bag was a slice of peach cobbler she had bought for Marcus, her 10-year-old son. She imagined his bright smile when she surprised him, and the thought gave her tired feet a little more strength. It was late, and Angela knew most people in her neighborhood had already gone to bed. The narrow road ahead was empty, except for the faint glow of headlights far down the street. She quickened her pace, hoping to get home before Marcus fell asleep. He hated sleeping without her nearby, and she had promised him they would eat dessert together. As she turned the corner near the small community park, Angela heard the low hum of a car engine behind her. She stepped aside instinctively, expecting the car to pass, but instead, it slowed down. Her chest tightened slightly, though she told herself there was nothing to worry about. It wasn't unusual for cars to drive through this area at night. Then the car stopped. Angela glanced back, and her heart skipped a beat. It was a police patrol car. The door opened, and Officer Richard Kane stepped out. Angela had seen him around Oak Ridge for years. His tall frame, sharp uniform, and firm voice were known throughout the town. Some people respected him, but many avoided him. She had always kept her distance, staying polite whenever she crossed paths with him. Tonight, however, there was no avoiding him. He was walking straight toward her. Angela swallowed hard and forced a small, polite smile. "Good evening, officer," she said softly, keeping her voice steady. Kane's eyes studied her carefully before he spoke. "Evening," he replied, his tone flat and unreadable. "Out a little late, aren't you?" Angela nodded quickly. "Yes, sir. Just coming back from work at the diner. My son's at home waiting for me." For a moment, there was silence. The street was still, the only sound coming from the buzzing street light above them. Kane's gaze lingered on her grocery bag before returning to her face. "Mind showing me some ID?" he asked. Angela hesitated for the briefest moment but quickly opened her purse and handed him her worn-out driver's license. She knew better than to question why, in Oak Ridge, you complied when an officer asked. Kane glanced at the ID, then at her again, his expression unreadable. "Everything okay, officer?" she asked carefully. Instead of answering, Kane stepped back slightly, as though deep in thought. The silence stretched uncomfortably, and Angela could feel her palms starting to sweat. She tightened her grip on the grocery bag, wanting nothing more than to continue her walk home. Finally, Kane handed back her ID. "Long night for you, huh?" he said casually. "Yes, sir," Angela replied, forcing another polite smile. "Just trying to take care of my boy." Kane gave a short nod but didn't move. The pause felt heavy, as if the world around them had slowed down. Angela shifted nervously, unsure whether to wait for him to dismiss her or quietly continue walking. She chose the latter. "Have a good evening, officer," she said softly and stepped forward. But before she could take more than 2 steps, Kane's voice stopped her. "Angela." She froze and turned back slowly. His face was calm, but his tone carried a weight she couldn't quite place. "Be careful walking home so late," he said finally. "Not everyone around here's trustworthy." Angela managed a faint nod, murmuring, "Thank you," before continuing on her way. As she walked away, her heart was still racing. There was something about the entire interaction that unsettled her, though she couldn't explain why. By the time she reached her small house on the edge of Maple Street, the porch light glowed warmly, and Marcus was sitting on the front steps, waiting for her. His face lit up the moment he saw the bag in her hand. "Is that, peach cobbler?" he asked excitedly, his eyes wide with anticipation. Angela smiled, brushing his curly hair back gently. "Of course it is. You've been patient all week. I thought you deserved a little treat." They went inside, and as Marcus eagerly unpacked the dessert, Angela took a deep breath, finally letting her shoulders relax. She tried to push the strange encounter with Kane from her mind. Tonight was for Marcus, and she didn't want to spoil the moment. Days turned into weeks, and life slowly returned to its routine: long shifts at work, homework evenings with Marcus, and quiet nights on the porch. Yet, deep inside, Angela couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed after that night. Every time she saw a police car drive by, her chest tightened just a little. And every now and then, she would catch Kane's patrol car idling nearby when she walked home, though he never stopped her again. She told herself it was just coincidence, but unease settled into the back of her mind. Meanwhile, Marcus noticed his mother's subtle tension, even though she tried to hide it. He was young, but he was observant. He'd often ask, "Mom, are you okay?" Angela would smile and assure him she was fine, but Marcus wasn't convinced. He watched her more closely now, silently promising himself that one day, he'd grow strong enough to protect her. One warm Saturday afternoon, Marcus sat by the window reading while Angela washed dishes in the kitchen. Suddenly, he called out, "Mom! That officer guy is outside again." Angela wiped her hands quickly and stepped to the window. Sure enough, Kane's car was parked across the street, engine running, his gaze fixed ahead. He didn't move, didn't wave, didn't say a word. After a few minutes, the car rolled away slowly, disappearing around the corner. Angela stood there for a moment, her heart pounding. She didn't want to alarm Marcus, so she forced a gentle smile and said, "Nothing to worry about, baby. Probably just doing his job." But deep down, she wondered if she was telling herself the same thing. That summer, Oak Ridge seemed to grow quieter, as if the entire town was holding its breath. Little things began to shift: whispers in the diner about changes coming, unspoken tensions between neighborhoods, and small incidents people didn't talk about openly but felt in their bones. Angela noticed it all, but she kept her focus where it mattered, on Marcus and their future. One late evening, after another long shift, Angela packed up her belongings and stepped out of the diner. The air was thick with humidity, and the street lights buzzed faintly in the silence. She glanced around, instinctively checking the corners of the street, and started her walk home. But halfway down the road, she heard the low rumble of a car engine behind her again. She didn't need to turn around to know who it was. It was Kane. Her steps slowed slightly, her breath caught in her throat, and for a brief second, she considered taking a different route home. But she dismissed the thought: why should she have to change her path? She reminded herself she had done nothing wrong. Angela took a deep breath, straightened her back, and kept walking forward. The car followed slowly for a moment, then stopped. The door creaked open, and Kane stepped out, his boots crunching softly against the pavement. He called out to her, his tone calm but firm. "Angela. Got a minute?" Angela turned, her face composed but cautious. "Yes, officer," she replied, her voice steady despite the tension in her chest. There was a pause long enough to make the moment feel endless. Finally, Kane said, "You should be careful walking home this late. Things happen at night. You understand?" Angela nodded politely. "Thank you for your concern, officer. I'll be careful." For several seconds, Kane didn't move, his gaze lingering on her before he finally nodded and returned to his car. The engine roared softly, and the patrol car rolled away into the distance. Angela stood there for a moment, trying to steady her breathing before continuing home. That night, as Marcus slept soundly in his room, Angela sat by the small kitchen table, her hands wrapped around a mug of tea. The soft hum of the refrigerator filled the silence as she stared at the faint glow of the street light outside. Her thoughts were heavy, her heart uneasy, and deep within her, she sensed something was coming. She didn't know what, or when, or how, but something about these quiet warnings, these strange encounters, and the stillness in Oakridge felt different now. Something was shifting beneath the surface. And though she couldn't see it yet, the events unfolding in her quiet little town were about to set a chain of consequences into motion, consequences that would change her life, her son's future, and even the fate of the very man who had unsettled her. The night outside was calm, but for Angela Carter, this was only the beginning of a storm. Me from the poorer neighborhoods, every step forward felt like pushing against a locked door. Opportunities were rare, and acceptance, even rarer. Angela had felt this weight for as long as she could remember. It was in the way some people looked at her when she walked into certain stores. It was in the whispers she overheard at the diner, the sudden silence when she entered a room, and the subtle reminders that, no matter how hard she worked, she was somehow expected to know her place. Angela learned to stay quiet, to work hard, and to focus on what mattered most. Marcus was different. Even at 10 years old, he carried a kind of light within him. He was curious, sharp, and always asking questions about the world. He loved reading books more than playing outside, and he dreamed big, bigger than Oakridge, bigger than the life his mother was living. He would often sit by the window, flipping through an old encyclopedia Angela had bought from a thrift store, and talk about becoming someone important one day. Angela would smile and stroke his hair, encouraging him gently, "Baby, you can be anything you want. Don't ever let anyone tell you different." And she meant it. Deep in her heart, Angela believed Marcus was destined for something greater. She just needed to keep him safe, guide him through the challenges ahead, and protect his dreams until he was strong enough to chase them himself. But the world around them wasn't always kind. Among the faces in Oakridge, there was one man everyone knew: Officer Richard Kane. To most people, Kane was a figure of authority, tall, broad-shouldered, and commanding. His deep voice carried weight wherever he went, and his uniform seemed to give him power beyond the law itself. For years, he had patrolled the streets, and while some respected him, many feared him, especially in the poorer parts of town. Angela didn't know Kane personally, but she had seen him around. Whenever his patrol car rolled down the street, people would step aside and lower their voices. There was something about his presence that made the air heavier, like a storm cloud passing overhead. Angela had learned one thing living in Oakridge: some things were better left unseen, unheard, and unspoken. And when it came to Officer Kane, silence was often safer than confrontation. Still, Angela kept her head down, avoided trouble, and focused on her son. She believed that if she worked hard enough, stayed quiet, and minded her own business, life would eventually get better. But even as she clung to hope, deep down she knew how fragile that hope could be. One late summer evening, as the sun dipped lower than usual, the town's air carried a strange stillness. The streets were nearly empty, except for the buzzing of cicadas in the distance. Angela walked home from the diner, balancing a small bag of groceries in one hand and her worn-out purse in the other. Her feet ached from the long shift, but her heart was light. She had promised Marcus she'd bring home his favorite treat, warm peach cobbler from the diner. She thought about how his face would light up when she surprised him. For Angela, these little moments were everything. They were the glue holding her small world together, giving her the strength to keep pushing forward despite the endless obstacles. But just around the corner, life had plans of its own. Angela didn't know it yet, but the events of that night would change everything for her, for Marcus, and for the quiet town of Oakridge. What she thought would be an ordinary walk home would become a turning point in her life, one that would leave lasting scars and set Marcus on a path no one could have predicted. And so, as the evening wind swept through the streets and the street lights flickered on one by one, Angela Carter unknowingly walked toward the moment that would define her son's destiny.